Forgive my voice, I went a little crazy at the George Clinton show. Hey everyone, Joey here, aka Animus, and today I am so excited to be finally talking about the third album from Porter Robinson, Smile. This American singer, songwriter, cult electronic musician really should not need any introduction to people who have clicked on this video, although I will say that my history with his music is probably quite different to most people's. I was too young and not yet actively seeking out music to listen to when his debut album Worlds released in 2014 and had an incredibly strong impact on the EDM scene of the time. It showed greater ambition, range, and emotional vulnerability than the vast majority of music releasing in that scene, and it seems that for many new fans, this album was a real eye-opener for the emotional impact that electronic music could have, and unlike anything they'd heard before. Personally, having heard Worlds for the first time more than 5 years after its release, I definitely see it as a flawed record, but an incredibly interesting one with some soaring high points and impressive displays of Porter's talent as a songwriter and producer. It makes total sense to me why some people would have latched so strongly onto his music at that point, but it seems that after his debut, this praise and these expectations all mounted up beyond what was good for Porter as an artist and as a person. He's open about having experienced writer's block, self-scrutiny, and poor mental health, and it was several years before he finally reached a place where he could release some of these unhealthy thought patterns and truly enjoy the process of making music again. And the result was some of my favourite music of all time. I don't even know how to talk about Nurture in brief. I really need to make a full, dedicated, in-depth video on this album at some point, because I have never on any other album felt so utterly seen by someone's songwriting. Porter almost sounded like a different artist on this record, but really I think was just laying his soul barer than he ever had before. The way he handled themes of creativity, introversion, nostalgia, self-worth, and just finding joy and purpose in life in general just became more and more special to me with each listen, to the point where I genuinely can't remember the last time I heard this album in full without tearing up at some point. And afterwards, I thought a lot about what potential follow-up we would have, because the ending of Nurture was so emotionally and thematically resolved that you almost didn't want anything added on to the end of it, and what would a third Porter Robinson album even look like? The irony there is, of course, that these were the very sky-high expectations that had held him back for the 7 years before Nurture's release. So when there were finally rumours of new music on the horizon, I decided it was only right to stop expecting a follow-up to Nurture, an album that captured such a specific point in the artist's life and arrived in such a perfect storm of my own experiences growing up, and just listen open-mindedly to whatever new direction he chose to take his new music in on its own terms. Which finally brings us to Smile. Speaking of the creative process behind his third album, Porter stated that the original vision for this record was just his fun pop album, pure inauthenticity, joyful abandon, good times, not taking himself too seriously as almost a mode of recovery after the emotional weight of Nurture and the last decade or so of his life as an artist. But long story short, he essentially failed to make this album, as it turned out he still had a lot more feelings to get off his chest even after Nurture, and when he started writing, what he was really thinking sort of managed to sneak its way into the music regardless of his original intentions. And this means that the personal themes that were generally absent from Nurture, despite their background presence in the record's creation, ended up being central to the narrative of Smile. Nurture was a very grounded, personal release that it was quite easy to directly empathize with, but on this album he acknowledges his reality as the performer he is far more directly than ever before. delving deep into these parasocial fan-artist relationships, the contrast between self-image and public image, the conflict between, on the one hand, finding a great sense of joy and purpose in sharing your art with the world, but on the other hand also having the weight of hundreds of thousands of listeners with emotional attachment to what you put out, their opinions and expectations, piling on top of your own imperfect sense of self-worth. The resulting tone throughout this album is unlike any of his previous releases, or really any recent music that specifically comes to mind for that matter. It can be fun, funny, absurd, dark, moving, or sometimes all of these at once. It's a striking mixture that doesn't make Porter Robinson as much of an immediately warm and inviting presence as he was on Nurture, but I think that's precisely the point. This is the album he really needed to make at this point, showing a different side of himself that's more messy, flawed, and turbulent, and it makes for an extremely interesting album to dissect and interpret. Speaking of things that strike you when you switch this thing on, Porter's once again evolved his sound in a bold new direction, but one that absolutely fits his songwriting and performances like a glove. This album sounds like the entire 2000s decade condensed into a delicious sundae with extra sprinkles on top. We get dance music, kitschy pop, soft rock, even a slight flavour of pop punk or Midwest emo at times, all executed with consistently fantastic production that's as good at being clean and luscious as it is at making you jump out of your seat with a noisy, incendiary crescendo. Needless to say, this is not the third Porter Robinson album I would have envisioned, and it's a heady blend of styles and themes that took some time to click with me properly, but in hindsight this record was a long time coming, and it absolutely makes for a necessary and compelling new chapter in his discography. Okay, shall we finally talk about some individual tracks? The biggest showcase we get of what his original all fun, zero authenticity vision might have been like would definitely be our opener, Knock Yourself Out. This track is very silly while also having something important to say. The ringtone-like melody that opens this thing is so simple and sugary sweet that really it shouldn't work, but it just worms its way into your brain and sticks there, aided by bright, explosive pop production. He plays into this idolized version of himself that someone in the Cult of Porter might envision, with all the rough edges shaved off, but sneaks in some candid admissions of how emotionally vulnerable he can still be at times, that even at his level of popularity you can't just stop yourself from caring what people think, and it's easy to fall into a sort of codependent relationship with your followers. Yes, I am still talking about the Bitch I'm Taylor Swift song. This track is brightly coloured and willingly goofy to an extent that none of the other cuts on here quite go to, meaning that I did take more time to come round to it than any of the other singles on here. And it also means that you'll know straight away if you don't vibe with the flavour of irony and humour on this record. But I've come to really appreciate the way it pulls you into the album with a sense of anarchic fun and raw, unfiltered self-expression. I should also mention that Porter pulled the bold move of stacking 3 of the 4 singles on this album, and the 3 that I actually listened to beforehand personally, right at the front of the album. But this does also mean that next we right away get the absolute firecracker of a song, Cheerleader. This is high-octane, thrillingly immediate pop rock with a synth hook that's raw and noisy as hell, hitting you right out of the gate and propelling the track into the stratosphere. The narrative on this one is mostly a continuation of what begun on the previous track, but from a more metaphorical, story-driven angle, with the cheerleader character personifying this intense adoration he's received from certain parts of his fan base, which is never really healthy for either party, but at the same time, of course, he feels a level of gratitude for the sentiments of love and support that shaped him into the person he is today and allowed him to reach this level. Most importantly, though, this thing just explodes with infectious energy and goes outrageously outrageously hard. So it seems that maybe this record will stay more light-hearted in tone and not perhaps pack the same emotional punch as Nurture. Nope, because the next track is Russian Roulette, and rest in peace, the piece of my tear ducts. It's worth mentioning here that even though he developed some of the prettiest sounding pitch shifting that I've ever heard in any music full stop on his last album, Smile is far more raw in its presentation of Porter's vocals. And that's great because he's a lovely singer. His natural voice is warm and expressive in my opinion, and it's great to hear it showcased on tracks like this. This song is not without its humorous or kitschy elements in its lyrics and its text-to-speech outro, but this is the most open Porter's ever been about just how much he struggled with his mental health over the course of his career. The fact that his own way of expressing this involves a certain amount of lightheartedness and not taking himself too seriously doesn't take away from just how heartbreaking the narrative of this track is, as he reveals that he's reached the point of suicidal ideation before turning things around in the bridge, as he's reminded of all he'd be leaving behind, all the people and simple little things in life that make it worth carrying on, and finally reaches the simple feeling of, I want to live. And at this point, I just melt apart. It's among the most beautiful and emotionally impactful passages of music in his entire discography up to this point. And then there's a whole propulsive, exuberant payoff, something comforting style. It is just such a roller coaster of emotions that it definitely took a few listens to fully appreciate, but my god, what a heavy hitter. Perfect Pinterest Garden is an interesting one because not only is it the single shortest piece on here, but it's also probably the most open to interpretation in terms of perspective switches, layers of irony, and whether or not the narrative is fictional. It's been intriguing to see what different people have taken away from this one. Personally, I don't take this track literally, more as a sort of exaggerated imaginary scenario that delves deep into the most toxic possibilities of a parasocial relationship between an artist and a fan. It doesn't add anything super special or unique to the record on its own, just fleshes out the themes that were already there nicely. Plus the grooves are tight as hell, and those beautiful little glimmers of Midwest emo style guitar are the icing on the cake for me. Year of the Cup is perhaps the single most raw and confessional piece on here. For better or for worse, depending on who you ask, because on one hand, like a lot of people, I do find the samples of Lil Wayne being interviewed on the topic of alcoholism a bit heavy-handed in terms of how they fit into the track. I don't find they quite gel with the other sounds and lyrics on this track, even if they could fit in thematically in a number of ways. But on the other hand, it's very admirable and important to the overall album how Porter places himself right out there on this song, flaws and all. He shows that he's still far more imperfect as a person and has far less of the answers than an album like Nurture might have led people to believe. And the vocal performance on here absolutely reflects this. It gets very guttural and is just very human to listen to. And that's the most important thing about this track. It is kind of a tough pill to swallow as a listener because it's played so totally straight and humanizes Porter so starkly. Also, this instrumental almost sounds like if he'd written the Goo Goo Dolls' Iris, and it's absolutely gorgeous. Kitsune Maison Freestyle ostensibly should lighten the mood again because this instrumental is cute as hell. Something about the blend of 8-bit influenced melodies, acoustic guitar, and a revamped Nurture vocal filter is just so warm and fuzzy to listen to, and on the surface this is almost just a light-hearted little bop about fashion, but underneath some purposefully shallow lines, there's still substance and more complex emotional undertones to pick out here. It's really about getting caught in a cycle of altering your appearance as if it's gonna fix something on the inside, while not really finding any real fulfillment at all. but ultimately it still manages to be such a comfy, cozy track to listen to, and I've loved coming back to this one in particular. Easier to Love You though. For the most part, this one has a pretty simple rock instrumental and chord progression, but this is one of the few cuts on here that absolutely hit me on that direct, personal, emotional level that Nurture did. It's a conversation with his teenage self, who's written a letter about his plans for the future, saying, "I can't shake the feeling that I'll be happy by the time I'm him." Meanwhile, there's him in the present feeling regretful and disappointed about some of the ways that his life panned out compared to these expectations, but in response his younger self is just like, "Look how far you've come, why can't you see yourself the way I see you, and wouldn't it be easier to love yourself if you did?" The funny thing is, I'm the 17-year-old, I would be the younger, more naive person in this narrative, and even so, emotionally, this thing is just... it's an incredibly beautiful and resonant piece of storytelling. Mona Lisa is the last straightforward banger on the album, and the only track with a feature in the form of alternative pop duo Frost Children. I view this as another parable of the most unhealthy side of fandom, imagining someone watching an artist who they idolize, feeling like there's a special personal connection between the two, and then remembering that they're really just one more face through the door. I really don't think that this track should be taken literally as a story involving Porter himself, or even a commentary specifically targeted at his own fan base. Again, I feel that it's a constructed narrative of how not to look at your favourite artists. They're not divine entities who can save you from your problems. They're ultimately just people with flaws like anyone else. Most importantly, this thing just goes hard in every conceivable way. It rocks harder than anything else on the LP. It's all heavy, grungy, and saturated, but sustained by a bunch of fantastic pop hooks that could easily get stuck in your head for days. But again, the next track is There Really No Happiness? And oh my god, this is right up there with Nurture standards. From the very beginning, it's this ridiculously beautiful, soft pillow of instrumentation, full and expansive, but incredibly luscious and easy on the ears, and that's all before this turns into a development of Porter's meditations on the potency of nostalgia, found on his last record. It's something he made out to seem like he'd gotten over, but it can still catch up with you and consume you, looking back at your childhood and wondering if you'll ever be able to just live in the here and now that same way again and appreciate its beauty, or if there's something that simply gets lost as you get older and more conscious of the passage of time. And these themes just hit like an emotional sledgehammer. This track isn't depressing, but it strikes you with such a strong sense of yearning that it makes me want to go back and listen to Unfold, which offers some sense of resolution and optimism on these same existential questions. Not that I think he's in a worse place, especially seeing how much quicker the turnaround of this album was, nor do I feel he's going back on anything he said on that track. Again, I just think he's opened up a different side of himself to his audience with this album, showing some of that hurt and longing which we sometimes have to learn to live with, rather than being able to overcome it entirely. Wow, my notes are intense. Luckily, you don't have to jump to another album to find a sense of solace after what that track hit you with, because our closer, Everything to Me, finally offers you a warm, cozy blanket and tells you everything's gonna be okay. With all this analysis of parasocial relationships and Porter saying, "Please don't deify your favourite artists," there was a risk of him seeming to push his fanbase away a little, or make an album that was quite a bitter pill to swallow as a listener. But here, underneath the guise of what could sound like a typical love song, he strongly affirms the beauty and meaningfulness of sharing his art with the world, and knowing that people feel comforted by it. On first listen, I almost thought that musically and lyrically this track was too simplistic, but to quote Russian Roulette, cliches are beautiful because they reflect us and we are beautiful. And just like the final few lines of his previous album, it's very moving just to hear an artist reach out with a little thank you like this. Even going so far as directly saying, I don't know you, so I shouldn't say I love you, but I do in a way. And so we do conclude on a note of hope. The song that arguably draws the least attention to itself on the surface ends up being perhaps the single most indispensable piece of the overall picture. And that smile. It's a bloody great album! Sure, it wasn't love at first listen, but heck, neither was Nurture at all actually, and look where I'm at with that album now. I think it's really fascinating how even Porter himself was surprised at how this album ended up. In theory, it should have been his most light-hearted, widely appealing release yet. But despite the general simplicity of its core musical ideas, the vibrant glossy sheen over many of the mixes, and glimpses of joyful, carefree abandon in the lyrics, I'd argue this might actually be his least accessible release yet. Not only is there intentionally a fair amount of bitterness and toxicity to the emotional landscape here, but the record really requires you to focus on and digest the lyrics. They can be very direct, but they can also leave their meaning up to subjective interpretation. That ambiguity sometimes left me a little cold initially, and the possibility for Porter's intentions and sentiments to get lost in translation, especially for someone without an awareness of his complicated history as an artist, could be seen as a flaw in his writing. At times you could, within reason, misconstrue that he was saying something like, haters don't want me doing my thing, but I've still got you all obsessed, too bad you don't really know me, or even, oh no, I'm famous, feel bad for me. But I strongly believe that either of these would be misreadings of an album that's not self-aggrandizing, but thoroughly self-deprecating. Nurture was genuinely such a beacon of light for so many people, myself included, but it also ended in a place where Porter seemed like he was more or less at peace with the world and had found some kind of balance. And this album doesn't undo or invalidate any of that, but demonstrates that life doesn't wrap up in happy endings in that way. It paints a far more messy and flawed picture of himself as a person who's still figuring himself out, makes bad decisions from time to time, and cares what people think more than he'd like to admit. What I feel he's really saying here is, I'm sorry, I'm not really worthy of you looking to me for the answers, but thank you for being there and we'll figure this out together. I realise the way I've been academically dissecting this album could make its commentary sound more conceptualised than it actually is. With the knowledge that this record wasn't even meant to turn out this way, I get the sense that some of these lyrics were almost a stream of consciousness, with Porter's personal feelings just flowing into the music in a natural and relatively unfiltered way. It just so happens that those feelings come from a very complex and interesting place. I've been thinking about this album so much since it came out, and look at how this video has ended up from just a 10-track, 40-minute record. Stylistically, I could nitpick some choices made here and there that I go back and forth on, and I'll acknowledge this is an uncompromisingly bright, brazen release that is going to divide people, definitely even within my audience. I feel like loud authenticity is often a divisive thing, and I've been on the other side of the fence for a fair few artists who express themselves in quite a similar way to how Porter does on Smile, meaning that I do respect and understand this album's detractors, it just might not be for you. To my ears though, I'm so happy to have been surprised by Porter Robinson in this way. This is a vibrant, engaging and emotionally compelling album, and I'm just about feeling an 8.5 out of 10 on this one. Thank you so much for sticking with me through this review. See you next time.